Before we expose every secret they tried to bury, hit subscribe so you don't miss the rest of the Resident Evil deep dives. From nuked cities to erased records and fake heroes, this is the full breakdown of every major cover-up the world was never supposed to know about. This timeline reveals how entire governments rewrote history just to pretend the apocalypse never happened. Part 1. Why the truth is always buried in Resident Evil. In the landscape of human history, the truth is often described as the first casualty of war. But in the era of biological terror, the truth was never even allowed to reach the battlefield. The central theme of the global biohazard crisis is that biological truth is fundamentally more dangerous to global stability than the weapons themselves. If the public realized that modern medicine, pharmaceutical advancement, and government oversight were directly responsible for creating the monsters that haunt their nightmares, civilization would collapse from a total loss of faith in its institutions. Every cover-up, every redacted file, and every sanitized news report is a desperate attempt by those in power to maintain the fragile illusion of human control. To admit the truth is to admit that the very structures built to protect humanity have instead engineered its extinction. The architecture of this deception is rooted in the fear of systemic collapse. If the citizens of the world understood that their taxes and their healthcare premiums were being diverted into the creation of mutagenic pathogens, the social contract would be rendered null and void. The authorities realized early on that a population paralyzed by the fear of their own doctors and leaders is impossible to govern. Therefore, the reality of the T virus and its successors had to be buried under layers of bureaucratic noise. They transformed biological massacres into industrial accidents and turned corporate greed into the actions of rogue terrorists. This allows the average person to sleep at night, believing that the world is a sane and manageable place, while in reality, they are living in a temporary reprieve between outbreaks. Furthermore, the suppression of the truth serves the interests of a global power structure that is deeply invested in the potential of biological weaponry. Information is the most valuable commodity in the post-Raccoon City world. By keeping the true nature of these pathogens classified, governments and corporations ensure that they maintain a monopoly on the research and the countermeasures. They have weaponized the concept of national security to shield themselves from any form of ethical or legal accountability. The burial of the truth is not just a defensive measure. It is a strategic necessity for the continuation of a dark research cycle that has spanned decades. The world does not know the truth because the truth is an existential threat to the status quo, and those at the top would rather see a city burn than see their secrets brought into the light of day. Part 2, Umbrella's First Lie, the public face versus secret bioweapons program. For decades, the Umbrella Corporation presented itself as the world's most trusted pharmaceutical giant, a beacon of progress and healing that operated under the slogan of providing health for everyone. This facade was the ultimate masterpiece of corporate propaganda, allowing them to hide the development of the T virus in plain sight. To the average consumer, Umbrella was the company that made the aspirin in their cabinet, the beauty products on their vanity, and the life-saving vaccines in their clinics. This massive revenue stream from harmless consumer products served a sinister purpose. It provided a limitless and untraceable pool of funding for illegal research. Umbrella essentially tricked the world into paying for the very pathogens designed to replace humanity, using the profits from healing to finance the architecture of destruction. The public face of Umbrella was carefully managed through a sophisticated public relations machine that prioritized optics over ethics. They built hospitals, funded schools, and sponsored local governments, creating a dependency that made them appear beyond reproach. Beneath this veneer of corporate responsibility, their secret laboratories were conducting experiments that defied the laws of nature and the Geneva Convention. The researchers who worked on the T virus were shielded by the company's massive legal department and a culture of extreme compartmentalization. Most employees truly believed they were working on breakthroughs in oncology or genetic therapy, never realizing that their work was being synthesized into a biological weapon of mass destruction. This dual identity allowed Umbrella to operate with a level of immunity that no government could match. They were a sovereign entity that transcended national borders, using their public influence to silence whistleblowers and buy the loyalty of regulatory agencies. The brilliance of the first lie was its simplicity. By becoming essential to the daily lives of billions, Umbrella made itself too big to fail and too trusted to question. They created a world where the logo of a red and white umbrella was synonymous with safety, even as the scientists behind that logo were engineering the end of the human race. The secret bioweapons program was not hidden in a basement. It was hidden behind a multi-billion-dollar brand that the world was conditioned to love. Part 3. The Spencer Estate. Cover-up. Early experiments. Hidden as accidents. Years before the catastrophic events of 1998, the Arklay Mountains were already a site of quiet, localized horror. The region was plagued by a series of cannibalistic murders, unexplained disappearances, and sightings of distorted, unnatural creatures. To any objective observer, these were the clear signs of a biological containment failure. But Umbrella used its immense influence over the local Raccoon City authorities to dictate the narrative. These early incidents were systematically classified as wild animal attacks or freak hiking accidents. By manipulating the local media and the sheriff's department, Umbrella ensured that the public remained oblivious to the fact that a high-security laboratory was leaking a mutagenic virus just miles from their homes. The Spencer Mansion itself was more than just a residence. It was a biological fail-safe designed with the specific intent of erasing evidence. Built by George Trevor under the orders of Oswell Spencer, the estate was a labyrinth of traps, hidden passages, and high-tech security measures. Most importantly, it was equipped with a hidden self-destruct system of immense thermal output. This was the ultimate insurance policy. If the research ever became uncontainable, or the authorities ever came too close to the truth, the mansion was designed to incinerate itself and everything within it. This early era of research was defined by a callous disregard for the local population, who were viewed as nothing more than an informal testing ground for the T virus's environmental stability. The cover-up of the Arklay incidents was a dress rehearsal for the larger deceptions that would follow. It proved that Umbrella could successfully control the flow of information, even in the face of grisly physical evidence. When local hikers found mutilated remains in the forest, Umbrella's assets within the police force would ensure that the autopsy reports were altered or the evidence was lost. They created a culture of silence in the mountains, where the strange lights in the sky and the screams in the woods were dismissed as local legends or the products of overactive imaginations. The fire that eventually consumed the mansion in July of 1998 was not an accident. It was the final act of a long-standing policy of erasure, designed to ensure that the early failures of the T virus would never be linked back to the boardroom in Europe. Part 4. Corporate Immunity. How Umbrella Bought Silence Worldwide. Umbrella achieved a level of global immunity that transformed the corporation into a shadow government, operating above the laws of any single nation. This was accomplished through a sprawling network of bribery, blackmail, and political infiltration, known internally as the family. By placing high-ranking officials, judges, and military leaders on their secret payroll, Umbrella ensured that any legal inquiry into their facilities was shut down long before it reached the public eye. They didn't just break the law, they purchased the law, creating a global environment where corporate interests were prioritized over human rights and environmental safety. This allowed them to operate research outposts on every continent, from the frozen wastes of Antarctica to the bustling centers of Paris and London, without fear of inspection. The family served as the enforcement arm of this immunity. If a politician became too inquisitive, they were silenced through financial ruin or personal scandal. If a journalist came too close to the truth, their stories were killed by editors who were also under Umbrella's influence. This created a wall of silence that surrounded the company for over 30 years. Umbrella's legal department was larger and better funded than the justice departments of many small countries, and they used this power to tie up any potential lawsuits in endless litigation. They turned the legal system into a weapon of attrition, wearing down any opponent through sheer financial force, until the truth became too expensive to pursue. This immunity allowed Umbrella to conduct human experimentation on a scale that had not been seen since the end of the Second World War. They moved viral samples across international borders with the same ease as shipping consumer goods, protected by customs officials who were instructed to look the other way. The global community was essentially held hostage by a corporation that held the keys to both the poison and the cure. This systemic corruption ensured that even when the evidence of their crimes began to leak, there was no authority willing or able to hold them accountable. Umbrella's immunity was the ultimate shield, proving that in a world driven by profit, the truth is a luxury that few can afford to defend. Part 5. Raccoon City's Fake Narrative. Chemical Leak Explained. When the situation in Raccoon City finally spiraled out of control in September of 1998, the authorities did not immediately admit to a viral outbreak. Instead, the initial public explanation was a toxic chemical spill in the Arklay Mountains. This lie was a calculated attempt to manage public panic and prevent the world from realizing that the city's water supply had been contaminated with a mutagenic virus. By framing the disaster as a traditional industrial accident, the military and the government could justify a total lockdown of the city under the guise of a hazmat quarantine. This provided them with the time and the isolation necessary to plan the city's ultimate destruction without the interference of international aid organizations or the press. The chemical leak narrative was supported by a series of falsified scientific reports and manufactured eyewitness accounts. The government controlled the media outlets, ensuring that the images coming out of the city were of soldiers in gas masks and decontamination tents rather than the shambling undead. This created a sense of orderly chaos, suggesting that the situation was being handled by professionals who understood the risks. In reality, the quarantine was not a rescue operation. It was a containment strategy designed to trap the infected and the witnesses within the city limits. The citizens of Raccoon City were being lied to as they died, told to stay in their homes and wait for a chemical neutralization that was never coming. This lie also allowed the military to test the limits of public compliance in the face of a biological crisis. They observed how easily a population could be controlled through the fear of an invisible chemical threat. using the fake narrative to justify the suspension of civil liberties and the implementation of martial law. The chemical leak explanation was the final act of gaslighting directed at the people of Raccoon City. It ensured that even as the city was being prepared for nuclear sterilization, the rest of the world believed it was merely a tragic industrial mishap. The truth of the T virus was kept hidden until the very end, buried under a pile of fake hazmat reports and the ashes of a city that was sacrificed to maintain a corporate secret. Part 6. The Police Department. Lie. Why the RPD was set up to fail. The Raccoon City Police Department, an institution theoretically dedicated to upholding law and order, was in fact a critical component of Umbrella's extensive cover-up operation. At the center of this corruption was Police Chief Brian Irons, a man whose depravity ran as deep as his loyalty to Umbrella's illicit funding. Irons was not merely on the Umbrella payroll, he was a deeply disturbed individual who reveled in the chaos and suffering that the corporation's activities unleashed. His role during the 1998 outbreak was not to protect the city, but to ensure its demise in a manner that would perfectly serve Umbrella's agenda. From the moment the first signs of the T virus began to manifest, Irons systematically dismantled the RPD's capacity to respond effectively, turning what should have been a bastion of safety into a death trap for his own officers and the remaining civilians. Irons intentionally distributed weapons and ammunition incorrectly, creating critical shortages in frontline units while stockpiling valuable resources in his personal office, surrounded by his macabre collection of taxidermy. He rerouted patrol units away from outbreak hotspots, sending them into areas already overrun by the infected, effectively sending them to their deaths. He deliberately blocked escape routes from the city, ordering his officers to reinforce barricades that trapped citizens inside, under the pretense of maintaining quarantine protocols. This calculated sabotage ensured that any organized resistance by the police force quickly collapsed, plunging the city into an uncontrollable anarchy that would expedite the virus's spread. The faster Raccoon City descended into chaos, the faster Umbrella could move to its final solution: total incineration. Perhaps Irons's most critical act of betrayal involved the Special Tactics and Rescue Service, or STARS. He actively worked to discredit the surviving STARS members, particularly Chris Redfield and Jill Valentine, after their harrowing escape from the Spencer mansion. He suppressed their reports, branded them as mentally unstable, and prevented any formal investigation into Umbrella. This was crucial because STARS represented the only unit with first-hand knowledge of Umbrella's bioweapons program. By neutralizing their credibility and authority, Irons ensured that the truth about the T virus would remain buried, preventing any early intervention that could have saved Raccoon City. The RPD was not meant to save the city. It was meant to be a tomb for any evidence that linked Umbrella to the growing biological catastrophe. Beyond the immediate sabotage, Irons's actions served to create a narrative that reinforced the chemical spill lie. The collapse of the RPD was presented to external agencies as a result of the overwhelming toxicity of the chemical agent and the sheer scale of the emergency. No one outside the city was meant to suspect that the chief of police was a deranged art collector who was actively facilitating the massacre of his own city. The ultimate betrayal by Brian Irons underscored the deep, pervasive corruption that defined Umbrella's global operations. It proved that the corporation could compromise not just politicians and scientists, but also the very guardians of public safety, turning them into willing accomplices in humanity's destruction. The RPD, under Irons's command, became a symbol of how easily trust could be weaponized and how effectively the truth could be buried under layers of official incompetence and malicious intent. Part 7. Hospital and Orphanage. Suppression, disappearing children. Beneath the veneer of a functioning metropolis, Raccoon City harbored a much darker secret, one that exposed the true depths of Umbrella Corporation's depravity. Its local medical and childcare facilities, particularly Alchemilla Hospital and the Raccoon City Orphanage, served as insidious human resource centers for experimentation. For decades, Umbrella utilized its deep ties to city governance and healthcare administration to facilitate a systematic, clandestine program of human trafficking and medical abuse. These institutions, ostensibly dedicated to healing and nurturing, were in reality covert pipelines, supplying Umbrella's various research branches with human test subjects, often the most vulnerable members of society. The files detailing the countless missing children from the orphanage and the unexplained deaths and disappearances from Alchemilla Hospital represented a damning record of Umbrella's long-term atrocities. As the 1998 outbreak spiraled into an uncontainable disaster, one of Umbrella's highest priorities was the complete eradication of this evidence. During the initial days of the T-virus spread, while the city descended into chaos, specialized Umbrella cleanup crews, often operating under the guise of emergency medical personnel, systematically scrubbed and destroyed decades' worth of patient records, birth certificates, and adoption papers. The official record after the outbreak stated unequivocally that these children never existed, effectively erasing Umbrella's long history of medical abuse and the countless lives it consumed for its scientific ambitions. The scale of this suppression was staggering. Imagine hundreds, perhaps thousands, of individual lives, each with a name, a family, and a story, completely wiped from existence as if they were mere clerical errors. This was not a reactive cover-up. It was a proactive policy. The disappearance of children provided Umbrella with fresh, uncompromised genetic material for their T and G virus research, particularly in the development of more stable and controllable strains. Children were considered ideal subjects due to their less developed immune systems and their higher malleability to viral alteration. The orphanage, therefore, was not merely a place of care, but a breeding ground for future bioorganic weapon test subjects. The implications of this specific lie extended far beyond Raccoon City. It showcased Umbrella's willingness to exploit universal symbols of innocence and care, hospitals and orphanages, for their most heinous acts. This deliberate perversion of trust solidified the company's status as a pure evil, prioritizing scientific advancement over any moral or ethical consideration. The fact that the US government, in its subsequent investigations, chose to implicitly endorse this erasure by not pursuing the missing persons reports vigorously highlights the profound complicity of state powers in Umbrella's crimes. The silenced cries of these disappearing children became part of the buried truth, serving as a chilling reminder that in the Resident Evil universe, humanity's most vulnerable are often the first to be sacrificed on the altar of hidden progress. Part 8. Media blackouts and censorship. As the T-virus outbreak in Raccoon City reached its critical mass, threatening to expose Umbrella's global conspiracy, the United States government initiated an unprecedented media blackout. This act of information control was deemed essential to prevent mass panic and to control the international narrative surrounding the unfolding catastrophe. With the official story of a toxic chemical spill rapidly losing credibility in the face of widespread zombification, a more aggressive approach to censorship was deployed. All landline communications in and out of Raccoon City were immediately severed, isolating the dying metropolis from the rest of the world. Simultaneously, sophisticated jamming equipment was deployed, scrambling all radio and television signals, effectively rendering the city silent. Reporters, photojournalists, and independent citizens attempting to broadcast footage of the undead hordes or the grotesque mutations were swiftly intercepted. Those who managed to get signals out were immediately shut down, their equipment seized, and in many cases they themselves were detained. The official justification for these detentions was national security and preventing the spread of disinformation during a hazardous materials incident. In reality, the government was desperate to prevent any unfiltered images or eyewitness accounts from reaching the global public. They understood that a single, unedited video of a licker or a tyrant would shatter the public's perception of reality and expose the decades of lies about bioweapons. The blackout served multiple strategic purposes. Firstly, it allowed the military to secure the perimeter and implement martial law without public scrutiny. No one outside Raccoon City saw the summary executions of infected civilians or the overwhelming failure of conventional forces to contain the threat. Secondly, it created a controlled environment for the government's own spin doctors to craft a palatable narrative. While the city was being consumed by horror, government agencies were already preparing the mission of mercy and laying the groundwork to scapegoat Umbrella entirely. The blackout ensured that the rest of the world saw only a silent, dark city, a tragic anomaly that disappeared off the map, rather than a biological massacre orchestrated by corporate and governmental negligence. This extensive censorship operation proved the government's willingness to manipulate public perception on an unprecedented scale. It highlighted the fragility of democratic institutions when faced with an existential threat. The media, often touted as the Fourth Estate, was rendered powerless, demonstrating how easily the flow of information could be weaponized by those in power. The silence that descended upon Raccoon City was not merely the absence of sound, it was the deliberate suppression of truth, designed to protect a far greater secret than just a single outbreak. It was a stark lesson in how deeply entrenched the conspiracy was, reaching into the highest levels of national authority, all to bury the truth about humanity's impending biological doom. Part 9. Survivors silenced. What happened to witnesses? The survival of any individual from the Raccoon City outbreak posed an immediate and profound threat to the carefully constructed narrative of a chemical spill, and more importantly, to the ongoing secrecy surrounding Umbrella's bioweapons program. Consequently, the United States government and its shadowy operatives initiated an aggressive campaign to silence every single survivor who managed to escape the city's perimeter or the subsequent nuclear sterilization. This was not a random act of cleanup. It was a highly organized effort to control information at its source, eliminating any potential leaks that could expose the true biological nature of the disaster. Major survivors, particularly those with unique knowledge or skills, were immediately intercepted and subjected to a different form of containment. Leon S. Kennedy, a rookie police officer who had witnessed the full scale of the T-virus outbreak, was a prime target. His survival, combined with his direct exposure to the G-virus and his protective relationship with Sherry Birkin, daughter of Umbrella's lead G-virus researcher, made him an invaluable asset and a profound liability. Leon was not simply released. He was blackmailed into becoming a government agent. His silence was effectively purchased with a lifetime of service, his every movement monitored, and his loyalty secured by the implicit threat to Sherry's safety. Sherry herself was placed under government protection and continuous medical observation, her existence a living testament to the G virus, effectively making her a pawn in a larger game of bioweapon development. Minor witnesses, those nameless civilians who managed to crawl out of the blast zone or were rescued from the edges of the quarantine, faced an equally chilling fate. They were typically detained in secure quarantine facilities, often located in remote military bases. Here, their harrowing accounts of flesh-eating zombies, giant insects, and grotesque mutations were systematically discredited. Psychologists, often working for government contractors, officially labeled their testimonies as trauma-induced hallucinations, mass hysteria, or paranoid delusions brought on by the stress of surviving a perceived chemical disaster. These individuals were either institutionalized, medicated into compliant silence, or eventually released back into society after their stories had been thoroughly neutralized and their credibility destroyed. Their freedom came at the cost of their truth. The silencing of survivors was a multi-pronged psychological operation designed to ensure that no legitimate voice could ever challenge the official narrative. It was a testament to the government's absolute commitment to burying the truth about bioweapons. The individual experiences of terror and loss were considered secondary to the larger goal of maintaining control over public perception. By turning heroes into psychological cases and vital witnesses into government assets, the powers that be ensured that Raccoon City would remain a tragic, but ultimately inexplicable, blip in history. The real truth, the biological truth, was not allowed to exist outside the classified files, guaranteeing that the general population would remain blissfully unaware of the true nature of the enemy lurking in the shadows of their world. Part 10. The decision to nuke Raccoon City. Who really authorized it? The order to execute the mission of mercy, the nuclear sterilization of Raccoon City, ostensibly came from the President of the United States. However, the true authorization and the orchestration of this cataclysmic event originated from a much deeper, more insidious level of power. It was the clandestine committee, an unelected body of global power brokers, corporate executives, and military strategists, along with key figures like Derek C. Simmons, who truly pushed for the nuclear option. The atomic detonation was not a last-ditch rescue effort. It was the ultimate cleanup of a failed umbrella corporation experiment that had become an irredeemable national and international liability. It remains the most extreme cover-up in American history, designed to erase a problem rather than solve it. Derek Simmons, a highly influential figure within the United States government and a member of the secret family organization with deep ties to Umbrella, played a pivotal role in this decision. Simmons understood the multifaceted threats posed by a city overrun by highly mutable biological weapons. He knew that the T virus was not the only pathogen at play. The G virus, with its regenerative capabilities and rapid evolution, presented an uncontainable risk. The nuclear strike was deemed the only sure way to physically sterilize the biological agents at their source, preventing their spread across the continent and, eventually, the globe. This was a purely pragmatic decision, devoid of any humanitarian consideration for the tens of thousands of trapped civilians who were still alive within the quarantine zone. Their lives were simply acceptable collateral damage in the war against exposed secrets. Furthermore, the decision to use a nuclear weapon had profound political implications. It signaled to the world that the United States government possessed the ultimate solution to a biohazard outbreak, thereby maintaining a facade of control. It allowed the government to act decisively, showcasing its power while simultaneously destroying all direct evidence of its complicity with Umbrella. The nuclear blast would not only incinerate the infected, but also any remaining research data, corporate records, or human testimony that could definitively link Umbrella's operations to governmental oversight, or even direct collaboration. It was a strategic erasure, a geopolitical gambit designed to protect the integrity of the state and the shadow organizations that influenced it. The authorization for the mission of mercy was executed with chilling efficiency, bypassing traditional democratic processes and proving that in times of extreme crisis, the true power lies with those willing to make the unthinkable choice. The president's signature was merely a formality, a public-facing endorsement of a decision that had already been made in secret chambers. Raccoon City was sacrificed not just to contain a virus, but to contain the truth. The blinding flash of the nuclear bomb was meant to erase not just a city, but the very possibility of public knowledge about the insidious collaboration between pharmaceutical giants and global governments in the creation of biological weapons. It was the ultimate lie, paid for with the lives of 100,000 people, ensuring that the dark research could continue unimpeded in the shadows. Part 11. Blaming Umbrella. Alone, government scapegoating. In the immediate wake of the Raccoon City incineration, the United States government found itself facing a potential crisis of legitimacy that threatened to dismantle the very foundations of federal authority. To survive the inevitable public outcry and international scrutiny, the state apparatus executed a masterful campaign of strategic scapegoating. They shifted 100% of the blame for the disaster onto the Umbrella Corporation. By casting Umbrella as a rogue, megalomaniacal corporate entity that had operated entirely outside the bounds of government knowledge or oversight, the federal government successfully positioned itself as a fellow victim of corporate greed rather than a complicit partner in biological research. This narrative allowed the public to feel a cathartic sense of justice when Umbrella eventually faced its legal and financial collapse in the year 2003. However, the reality of this scapegoating was far more cynical. The government's public crusade against Umbrella was a smokescreen designed to mask their own extensive involvement in the company's history. For decades, various government agencies had been consumers of Umbrella's data, and military contractors had frequently collaborated on the development of bioorganic weapons under the guise of defensive research. By making Umbrella the sole villain of the Raccoon City story, the government was able to quietly absorb the company's most valuable researchers, samples, and data after the corporate collapse. The scientists who had once worked in secret Umbrella labs were simply transferred to new, state-funded facilities with different acronyms on the door. The company was dismantled, but the research it pioneered was preserved and internalized by the very government that claimed to be investigating it. This strategy of isolation and blame also served to prevent a broader inquiry into the global pharmaceutical industry. If Umbrella had been exposed as a partner of the state, it would have led to questions about every major medical and military contract in the country. Instead, the government created a black and white morality play, where Umbrella was the monster and the federal investigators were the heroes. They used the 23-year history of the company as a convenient dumping ground for every ethical violation and scientific overreach of the era. When the public saw images of Umbrella executives being led away in handcuffs, They believed the nightmare was over. They didn't realize that the government was simply pruning a branch of a much larger tree of biological experimentation. The scapegoating was a perfect victory for the state. It provided a visible target for public anger, while ensuring that the actual machinery of bioweapon development remained functional and protected by the veil of national security. Part 12. Destroying evidence with fire. The choice to use a tactical nuclear weapon on Raccoon City was not a matter of military necessity in terms of troop movements, nor was it a humanitarian gesture to end the suffering of the infected. It was a precise, forensic decision based on the unique biological characteristics of the G virus. The government's lead scientists and figures like Derek Simmons knew that the G virus possessed near infinite regenerative capabilities and a rate of mutation that could eventually render it immune to conventional weapons. A standard carpet bombing or even a chemical strike would not have been enough to ensure total sterilization. The nuclear strike, specifically the Mission of Mercy, was chosen for its extreme thermal output. At the heart of a nuclear detonation, temperatures reach millions of degrees, ensuring that every single cell of the mutagenic pathogens was entirely incinerated at the molecular level. Fire was the ultimate forensic eraser. The thermal pulse ensured that no independent forensics team, international watchdog, or human rights group could ever prove the government's pre-outbreak collusion with Umbrella. By turning the city into a field of glass and ash, the government effectively sanitized the crime scene of the century. They destroyed the lab reports, the physical samples of the virus, and the mutated bodies of the test subjects that would have served as irrefutable evidence in a court of law. Even the underground facilities, built to withstand conventional intrusion, were collapsed and fused by the sheer pressure and heat of the blast. The fire did more than just kill the infected. It killed the history of what had happened in Raccoon City, leaving behind only a radioactive void that would remain inaccessible to private investigators for decades. Furthermore, the fire served a psychological purpose. It provided a visual finality to the Raccoon City incident. The image of the mushroom cloud over the American heartland was a traumatic signal to the rest of the world that the threat had been sterilized. It allowed the government to argue that any further investigation was unnecessary because there was nothing left to investigate. They turned a city of 100,000 people into a clean slate, ensuring that any surviving evidence of the government's Project Birkin or their secret contracts with Spencer were burned out of existence. The decision to use fire was the ultimate admission that the truth was so dangerous that it required a sun-level heat to bury it. It remains the most extreme example of evidence destruction in human history, proving that when the state is backed into a corner by its own biological secrets, it will not hesitate to use the most destructive power in the human arsenal to light the fuse of a total cover-up. Part 13. Covering up the cover-up. Lost records and redacted files. In the 2 decades following the 1998 incident, the narrative of Raccoon City has been maintained through a process of aggressive bureaucratic attrition. Any attempts by independent journalists, historians, or family members of the victims to gain access to the truth through Freedom of Information Act requests have been met with a brick wall of state secrecy. The government has perfected the art of the redacted file, releasing thousands of pages of documentation where every meaningful detail, names, dates, locations, and chemical formulas is blacked out with heavy ink. These files are released to the public as a gesture of transparency, but they are functionally useless, providing a skeleton of the truth without any of the meat. This is the cover-up of the cover-up, a secondary layer of defense designed to protect the initial lies of 1998. a significant portion of the most damning evidence was simply declared lost or destroyed during the emergency. Official records of military movements, communication logs between the White House and Umbrella headquarters, and the specific authorization chains for the nuclear strike have conveniently disappeared from the National Archives. When questioned, the government cites the chaos of the Raccoon City collapse as the reason for these missing files, claiming that the emergency prevented proper record keeping. This creates a bureaucratic black hole where the truth once lived. By claiming that the records don't exist, the government forces the burden of proof onto the accusers, knowing full well that no independent party has the resources to challenge a missing file in the face of national security classifications. This wall of silence is maintained by a specialized branch of the Department of Defense and figures within the intelligence community who view the Raccoon City data as a permanent national asset. They have classified the biological reality of the T and G viruses under the highest levels of clearance, ensuring that even elected officials in Congress are often denied access to the full story. The government has essentially created a parallel history of the event, one that is taught in schools and documented in public libraries, while the true history remains locked in deep storage bunkers. This ensures that as time passes and the survivors age, the official version of the story becomes the only version that survives. The redaction of the truth is not a one-time event, but an ongoing process of memory management, ensuring that the legacy of Raccoon City remains a sterilized, manageable mystery rather than a call to accountability for those who authorized the destruction of an American city. Part 14, The Fall of Umbrella, was a lie. Why it never truly ended. The widely publicized legal collapse and bankruptcy of the Umbrella Corporation in the year 2003 was not the death of the bioweapon industry. It was its most successful rebranding. To the general public, the end of Umbrella represented a victory for global justice, a sign that the monster had finally been slain. In reality, the collapse was a managed dissolution that allowed Umbrella's most dangerous assets to be distributed across the global landscape. The company didn't die. It fragmented, becoming an invisible virus itself that infected every major private military company, pharmaceutical giant, and military laboratory in the world. The researchers who had spent decades mastering the T virus were not simply unemployed. They were the most sought-after experts in the world, snapped up by governments and rogue organizations who were eager to continue Umbrella's work under new names. The dispersal of Umbrella's data was a global catastrophe, hidden behind a legal victory. When the company's assets were seized, a significant portion of their proprietary research was leaked onto the dark web or sold in secret auctions to the highest bidder. This ensured that the blueprints for biological horror were no longer concentrated in one boardroom, but were now decentralized and impossible to contain. The fall of Umbrella effectively democratized the biohazard, moving it from the hands of a single corporation into the hands of anyone with enough money to hire a former Umbrella scientist. This was a tactical success for the global power structure, as it created a world of perpetual rogue threats that justified endless military spending and the continued development of defensive biological countermeasures. The transition from the Umbrella era to the modern age was a move from a visible monopoly to a hidden ecosystem of terror. Organizations like Tricell, Will Pharma, and even the reformed Blue Umbrella were built on the foundations laid by Spencer and Birkin. The fall of the original company provided a convenient scapegoat for all future outbreaks. Whenever a new virus appeared, it could be blamed on remnants of Umbrella or stolen research. allowing current governments and corporations to avoid responsibility. The world was told that the era of Umbrella was over, while in reality, the company's legacy had become the bedrock of a new, global bioweapon economy. The fall was merely the moment the virus left the lab and entered the bloodstream of the entire planet, ensuring that Umbrella's vision of a post-human world would continue long after its logo was scrubbed from the buildings. Part 15. Bioterrorism, rebranded from Umbrella to rogue groups. Following the collapse of Umbrella, the international community and global media outlets began to adopt a new lexicon for biological incidents. Every subsequent outbreak, whether it was the Terra Grigia panic involving Il Veltro, the Los Iluminados incident in Spain, or the eventual rise of Neo Umbrella, was carefully framed as an isolated act of terrorism by a rogue group. This branding was a strategic masterstroke designed to prevent the public from connecting the dots. If these groups were seen as independent actors, then the world's superpowers could maintain the lie that biological weapons were under control, and that Umbrella was a relic of the past. In reality, every single one of these groups was a direct descendant of the original research, utilizing the viral strains and tactical data that had been lost during Umbrella's dissolution. By branding these incidents as terrorism, governments were able to shift the focus from the science to the ideology. Instead of discussing the ethics of mutagenic research, the public conversation was steered toward the fanaticism of the group in question. This allowed the global defense industry to market the BSAA and other paramilitary organizations as protectors against a new, decentralized enemy. It created a perpetual war on terror that focused on the symptom, the outbreak, rather than the cause, the continued existence and proliferation of the viruses themselves. The rogue group narrative provided a convenient way for world leaders to avoid admitting that the pathogens were being produced in labs that they themselves were funding through shell companies and black budgets. This rebranding also allowed for the weaponization of fear as a tool of domestic control. When an outbreak occurred, it wasn't seen as a failure of government oversight. It was seen as a reason to grant the government more power to combat terrorism. The public was told that the only way to stay safe from rogue actors was to increase surveillance, expand the military, and allow organizations like the BSAA to operate with near total immunity. This created a cycle where the very existence of bioterror fueled the growth of the security apparatus. The world was led to believe that they were living in a post-Umbrella age of security, while in reality they were living in a world where the Umbrella legacy had been repackaged and sold as a series of convenient, manageable villains. The rebranding of bioterrorism ensured that the true architects of the biological age could stay in power, while the world remained focused on whatever rogue logo appeared in the next news cycle. Part 16. Las Plagas. Suppression, Spain, Salazar, and international silence. The 2004 incident in a remote mountainous region of Spain represented one of the most significant and terrifying shifts in the history of biological warfare, yet it remains one of the most aggressively suppressed events in the public record. Unlike the viral outbreaks of Raccoon City, the threat in Spain was parasitic, the Las Plagas. This was not a mindless infection, but a sophisticated, ancient organism capable of total neurological hijacking, allowing a central alpha host to control the actions of an entire population. When the daughter of the President of the United States was kidnapped by the Los Iluminados cult, it triggered a mission that exposed a nightmare even more dangerous than the T virus. However, the official international documentation of this event was systematically scrubbed. the existence of a mind-controlling parasite was deemed too destabilizing for the public to ever know. The suppression of the Las Plagas was a coordinated effort between the United States and European intelligence agencies. The official story presented to the global press was that of a religious cult kidnapping involving a fringe extremist group. There was absolutely no mention of the ganados, the infected villagers who maintained a horrifying level of coordination and tactical intelligence. The international community was led to believe that the mission, spearheaded by Leon S. Kennedy, was a standard counter-terrorism operation against human traffickers. If the public had realized that a parasite existed which could turn a neighbor, a soldier, or a world leader into a puppet while leaving their outward appearance intact, the resulting global paranoia would have shattered the foundations of international diplomacy. This silence was also driven by the strategic value of the parasite itself. Even as the government suppressed the news, various shadow organizations, including those linked to Albert Wesker, were working to secure samples of the dominant species, Plaga. The ability to control a population without destroying the infrastructure of a city was the ultimate goal for any aspiring dictator or rogue state. By keeping the Spain incident out of the headlines, the world's superpowers ensured that the race to weaponize the Plaga could continue in total secrecy. The villagers of the Salazar region were erased from history, their horrific transformations and the subsequent slaughter classified as collateral damage in a localized conflict. The truth of the Plagas was buried in a vault, leaving the world blissfully unaware that the concept of free will was now a biological variable that could be switched off by the highest bidder. Part 17. African Incident. Whitewashing. RE5's Unspoken Truths. In the year 2009, the world came within 48 hours of total biological extinction. The Kijuju outbreak in Africa, orchestrated by Albert Wesker and the Tricell Corporation, was the launchpad for the Ouroboros Plan, a global saturation event designed to forcibly evolve or kill every human being on the planet. This was the peak of the biological threat, a moment where the iron and sorrow of the frontline soldiers was the only thing standing between humanity and its final day. Yet in the aftermath of Wesker's defeat, the BSAA and the United Nations executed a massive whitewashing campaign. The public was told that Kijuju was a localized civil uprising, exacerbated by a limited biological accident. The true scale of the Ouroboros threat, the fact that a single jet could have ended the human race, was strictly classified as Class 1 secrecy. The whitewashing was a survival tactic for the global elite. If the world's population had grasped how close they came to total saturation, it would have triggered an unprecedented global economic and social collapse. People would have stopped going to work, markets would have disintegrated, and the fear of the very air they breathed would have turned every city into a war zone. To prevent this, the BSAA sanitized the reports. They characterized the Magini as victims of a localized parasitic strain and downplayed Tricell's global infrastructure. They focused the narrative on the heroic intervention of the BSAA, turning a near apocalypse into a triumphant marketing story for the newly formed alliance. The unspoken truth of Resident Evil 5 is that the global security apparatus was completely helpless against Wesker's plan. The BSAA was almost entirely wiped out in the initial waves of the African operation, and it was only through the rogue persistence of Chris Redfield and Sheva Alomar that the world survived. The whitewashing masked this systemic failure. By reporting the incident as a managed success, the UN was able to secure more funding and power for the BSAA, hiding the fact that their global shield was actually a paper tiger. The African continent became a testing ground for the world's silence. The thousands of lives lost in Kijuju were reduced to a footnote in a report about regional stability. The true horror that humanity is just one vial away from the end was once again buried to preserve the status quo. Part 18, BSAA's Dirty Secrets. Who they actually answer to the Bioterrorism Security Assessment Alliance, or BSAA, was founded as an idealistic non-governmental organization dedicated to protecting a world shattered by Umbrella's legacy. It was meant to be the anti-Umbrella, a transparent and heroic force that transcended national politics. However, as the organization grew, it fell under the shadow of the very forces it was meant to fight. By the late 2010s, the BSAA had become a bloated, compromised entity. While it claimed to answer to the United Nations, its true masters were the Global Pharmaceutical Federation and the various world powers that provided its multi-billion-dollar budget. This created a profound conflict of interest. The organization responsible for hunting bioweapons was being funded by the corporations that profited from their defensive development. The most damning of the BSAA's dirty secrets was its eventual shift into the use of the very technology it condemned. By the year 2021, the Alliance had secretly integrated bioorganic weapons into its own tactical units. These were not just soldiers in suits. They were biologically enhanced, stable mutations, used to minimize human casualties among the elite ranks. The heroes had effectively become the new Umbrella, utilizing viral research to maintain their dominance on the battlefield. This hypocrisy was shielded by a wall of international authority, because the BSAA held the exclusive right to investigate bioincidents. They could easily cover up their own use of pathogens, reporting their mutated operatives as specialized drone technology or advanced cybernetics in public documents. This institutional rot transformed the BSAA from a shield into a weapon of control. They became the janitors of the global elite, cleaning up messy outbreaks before they could affect the bottom line of their pharmaceutical funders. Chris Redfield's eventually rogue status was a direct result of this corruption. He realized that the badge he wore was being used to sanitize corporate crimes. The BSAA's dirty secrets represent the ultimate betrayal of the Raccoon City survivors. The world was led to believe that a new order of safety had been established, but in reality, the monster had simply put on a uniform. The truth about who the BSAA actually answers to is the final realization that there are no neutral parties in the war for biological supremacy. There is only the entity currently holding the syringe. Part 19, Weaponizing Fear, How Governments Control the Narrative. Following the global chaos of the C virus in 2013, which saw the destruction of Lanxiang and the attack on tall oaks, world governments realized that biological horror could be used as the ultimate tool for domestic control. They began to weaponize the fear of the next T virus or C virus to justify a permanent state of emergency. This narrative shifted the public's perception of safety. Instead of fearing foreign armies, they were taught to fear their own biology. Governments used this atmospheric dread to pass sweeping surveillance laws and massive increases in military spending that would have been unthinkable in a pre-Raccoon City world. Bioterrorism became the perfect, invisible enemy, a threat that was everywhere and nowhere, requiring a total and permanent suspension of normal civil liberties. The control of the narrative was achieved through a process of biosecurity theatre, Every time a minor incident occurred, the government would flood the news cycle with images of specialized containment units and mandatory quarantine drills. This kept the trauma of 1998 fresh in the minds of the public, ensuring their compliance. They used the threat of the next outbreak to crack down on dissent, branding whistleblowers or independent researchers as threats to public health or potential bioterrorists. This allowed the state to monopolize the conversation around safety, ensuring that the only solutions presented were those that increased government power and benefited the military-industrial complex. This weaponized fear also served to distract from the continued development of biological weapons by the very states that claimed to be protecting their citizens. By keeping the population in a state of constant anxiety about rogue groups and lone actors, the government could conduct its own high-risk research in secret, labeling it as essential for national defense. The narrative was no longer about preventing outbreaks, but about managing the inevitable. This effectively turned the human race into a captive audience for a series of state-sponsored survival myths. The fear was not just a side effect of the viruses. It was a deliberate strategy used to rewrite the social contract, making the public trade their freedom for a promise of security that the government knew it could never truly keep. Part 20. Rewriting Survivor Testimonies. As the decades passed since the first outbreaks, the historical record of the biological wars has been systematically revised. Survivors who were once considered heroes and vital witnesses have been slowly categorized as unreliable narrators by state-funded historians and psychologists. The government realized that the raw, unedited testimonies of people like Leon Kennedy, Jill Valentine, or the survivors of Terra Grigia were too dangerous to remain in the public consciousness. These accounts contained the biological truth, the visceral reality of what the viruses do to the human body and soul. To counter this, official reports of the Lanxiang or Tall Oaks outbreaks were released as sanitized versions, omitting the most terrifying details and reducing the death counts to manageable numbers. This rewriting of history is a form of psychological erasure. Survivor testimonies are often pathologized, with their descriptions of monsters and government collusion dismissed as post-traumatic stress-induced fabulation. By framing the survivors as mentally unstable, the state ensures that their warnings about the continued existence of the viruses are ignored. This has created a generational gap in knowledge. The children born after 2010 view Raccoon City as a distant, almost mythical tragedy, rather than a blueprint for their own future. The government-sanctioned history books teach a version of the biological age that is clean, orderly, and ultimately under control. The revisionist narrative also serves to protect the reputation of current political and corporate leaders. Any evidence of pre-outbreak negligence or the intentional sacrifice of civilian populations is scrubbed from the record. The state-funded Museum of Biosecurity in the rebuilt Raccoon City area, for example, portrays the nuclear strike as a heroic and unanimous decision made solely to save the world, ignoring the internal debates and the corporate ties that actually drove the order. By rewriting survivor testimonies, the powers that be are ensuring that the next generation remains blissfully unaware of the true biological reality. They are erasing the lessons of the past to ensure that the mistakes can be repeated in secret, leaving the world vulnerable to a truth that no amount of historical revisionism will be able to stop when the next vial breaks. Part 21. Why Chris Redfield was allowed to keep operating. In the world of international biosecurity, Chris Redfield is an anomaly that defies traditional military and legal logic. Despite his frequent rogue operations and his blatant disregard for the bureaucratic protocols of the BSAA, he has been allowed to keep operating at the highest levels of global defense. This is not due to a lack of oversight, but rather a cold, calculated decision by the powers that be. Chris Redfield is the necessary shadow. The governments and organizations that fund the BSAA allow him to operate outside the law because he is the only operative capable of stopping the threats that their official, compromised channels cannot. He is the valve that releases the pressure of the bioweapon world. A man who can navigate the filth and the horror to achieve the results that a sanitized, legalistic force would never be allowed to attempt. The legend of Chris Redfield is a carefully maintained state asset. By allowing him to remain a public hero, the global authorities can give the population a symbol of hope. A man who survived Raccoon City and defeated Wesker. This public adoration serves as a perfect cover. While the world cheers for the hero, the government continues its own dark research in the background, knowing that if one of their projects ever goes hot, they can simply point Chris at the problem and let him do what he does best. He is essentially a containment unit in human form. His legendary status provides him with a level of social and political immunity. To arrest or silence him would be to admit that the world's greatest protector is at odds with the system itself. Therefore, they tolerate his insubordination, because the alternative, a world without Chris Redfield, is far more dangerous to their long-term stability. However, this allowance comes with a heavy price for Redfield himself. He is perpetually isolated, a man used by the system he increasingly distrusts. He is allowed to operate because he is a known quantity who is fundamentally driven by a protective instinct, making his actions predictable to those who study him. The state uses his survivors' guilt as a leash, knowing he will never walk away as long as there are lives to be saved. He is the ultimate tool of the biological age, a soldier who can operate in the grey zones of morality where governments cannot officially set foot. His continued operation is a testament to the fact that the world is no longer governed by laws, but by the management of crisis. Chris Redfield is the manager of the final crisis, a man kept on the board only because the game cannot continue without him. Part 22. The Mold Cover-Up. RE7's Contaminated Truth. The 2017 incident in Dulvey, Louisiana, stands as one of the most successful, localized cover-ups in modern American history. To the outside world, the total destruction of the Baker family and the surrounding plantation was documented as a meth lab explosion, or a series of unexplained mass murders carried out by a patriarch suffering from severe mental illness. The reality of the mutamycete, the mold, was entirely scrubbed from the public record. The existence of a sentient fungal intelligence capable of overwriting human minds, creating hive mind structures, and regenerating limbs was deemed far too dangerous to reveal. The truth of the E-series bioweapon, specifically the girl known as Eveline, was buried under the scorched earth of the bayou, ensuring that the public never realized how close they came to a silent, fungal colonization of the United States. The cleanup of Dulvey was a joint operation between the newly formed Blue Umbrella and the BSAA. Their primary goal was not just to rescue the survivors, but to ensure that the swamp's biological secrets were neutralized. They deployed specialized thermobaric agents to incinerate the molded and any trace of the fungal colonies, effectively glassing the area to prevent forensic analysis. The survivors, Ethan and Mia Winters, were not given their lives back. They were given classified identities and moved to a secure location in Europe. They were treated as contaminated assets rather than victims, their every movement monitored by the Hound Wolf Squad. The government realized that the mold represented a new paradigm in bioterror, a pathogen that didn't just kill, but replaced the host's personality entirely. Admitting this would have created a level of paranoia that would make the T-virus scares look like a mild concern. Furthermore, the Dulvey cover-up protected the reputation of the Connections, the shadowy organization that developed the E-series. By refusing to officially link the Baker tragedy to a larger international conspiracy, the authorities allowed the architects of the mold to slip back into the darkness. The official record of the event is a masterpiece of bureaucratic misdirection, focusing on the tragedy of a broken family, rather than the failure of global biological containment. The contaminated truth of RE7 is that the world is now dealing with organisms that can hide inside the human psyche. The Louisiana swamp was not a crime scene. It was a burial ground for the truth about the next evolution of biological warfare, a truth that Chris Redfield and Blue Umbrella decided the world was not yet ready to hear. Part 23, Village Incident, Suppression, RE8's classified files. The total destruction of a remote mountain village in Romania in 2021 was immediately categorized under the highest levels of global secrecy. The events involving the Megamice seat, the Four Lords, and the death of Ethan Winters were erased from the map before the smoke had even cleared from the valley. To the general public, the massive explosion in the mountains was recorded as an unexplained seismic event, or a localized gas pocket ignition. The village itself was scrubbed from satellite imagery and maps, officially declared a non-existent territory. This suppression was not just about the monsters. It was about the fact that the BSAA had been caught red-handed, using biological soldiers during the operation. The files regarding the village are some of the most protected documents in the history of the world, containing proof of the total moral collapse of the global security alliance. The Hound Wolf Squad, acting under the rogue command of Chris Redfield, was responsible for the immediate tactical cover-up. They ensured that the cradle of the mold, the megamycete core, was entirely obliterated, leaving no physical evidence for the BSAA to recover and weaponize further. However, the political cover-up was much more complex. The government had to manage the disappearance of an entire population and the death of a high-profile asset like Ethan Winters. They characterized the incident as a regional containment of a radical extremist cult, omitting any mention of Mother Miranda's decades-long biological research or her connection to Oswell Spencer. The fact that the founder of Umbrella had found his inspiration in this very village was a truth so explosive that it had to be buried at all costs. The suppression of the village incident also served to protect the infant Rose Winters, who represented the ultimate fusion of human and mutamycete biology. The state could not allow the world to know that a perfect biological organism had been born, as it would have triggered a global war to claim her. Therefore, her existence was classified as a matter of supreme national security, and she was raised in a vacuum of secrets, surrounded by the same guards who had erased the history of her father. The real story of the village, the tragedy of Ethan Winters, and the betrayal of the BSAA is a ghost story told only in the darkest corners of the intelligence community. To the rest of the world, the mountains of Romania are silent, hiding a classified truth that would shatter the current global order if it were ever brought to light. Part 24. The Real Lie. Why the world still doesn't know the truth. The ultimate lie, the one that underpins all others in the year 2026. is the pervasive belief that the era of Umbrella is over and that the threat is under control. The public is led to believe that they live in a world where biological terror is a managed risk, handled by competent international agencies and heroic figures. In reality, this is the most dangerous deception of all. Every major world power is currently sitting on a stockpile of biological weaponry that is exponentially more advanced, more stable, and more lethal than anything Oswell Spencer or Albert Wesker ever imagined. The world doesn't know the truth because the truth is that humanity is living on borrowed time, existing in a state of permanent, fragile equilibrium between competing biological superpowers. The truth is buried because to reveal it would be to admit that the war was lost decades ago. The viruses and the parasites have already infiltrated every level of global infrastructure. They are in the water, they are in the food supply, and they are in the medical research that humanity depends on. The real lie is that the world is still human. We are living in the shadow of a post-human future where the very definition of a natural person is being rewritten in secret laboratories. The governments keep this a secret because they are addicted to the power these pathogens provide. They use the threat of an outbreak to control their populations, while simultaneously using the viruses to enhance their own soldiers and leaders. It is a cycle of addiction and deception that has no exit strategy. As we look toward the future, the silence is the most terrifying symptom of the problem. The lack of public discourse about the biological reality means that when the final, uncontainable outbreak occurs, the world will be entirely unprepared. We are living in a temporary reprieve, a lull in the storm created by the efforts of men like Chris Redfield and the silence of the state. The real lie is the promise of safety. The truth is that the bottle has already been broken, and the contents are just waiting for the right moment to activate. Humanity is standing on the edge of a biological abyss, and the only reason we haven't fallen yet is that the fall is being managed by the same architects who built the edge. The world remains in the dark because the light would only reveal that there is nowhere left to run.